We cry out in pain, and the question rises unbidden. Why? Why would a good God, a loving Father, permit such suffering in the world he made? Surely if he is all-powerful, he could stop it. If he is all good, he would want to. And yet pain remains. The world groans under its weight, and we, fragile creatures that we are, groan with it. We recoil from suffering because it wounds, it breaks, it tears apart. And yet, have you ever considered that pain is also a teacher? That it speaks in a voice louder than comfort ever could? We can ignore joy, we can push aside quiet blessings, but pain demands our attention. It is the megaphone God uses to rouse a sleeping world. It is easy to believe in God when the sun shines and the path is smooth. But what if faith is meant for the storms? What if our struggle, rather than proving God absent, is precisely where we encounter him most deeply? Do we not see this echoed in the story of Christ himself? The hands that healed the blind were pierced. The voice that calmed the sea was parched on the cross. The very Son of God did not escape suffering, but walked through it, so that we might one day walk beyond it. But perhaps we still ask, could not an all-powerful God have created a world without pain? Yes, but only at the cost of love itself. A world with no suffering would be a world with no choice, no depth, no real goodness at all, only a sterile, mechanical existence. Love to be real must be freely given, and where there is freedom there is also the possibility of loss. It is not a flaw in the design, it is the price of something far greater. Yet even in our pain we are not abandoned. If we look with clear eyes, we see something remarkable. Suffering is never wasted. It can be transformed, redeemed. The darkest night of the soul can become the very place where the first light of hope dawns. And that hope points us beyond this world, beyond this pain, to a future where every tear will be wiped away. So let us not despair. Pain is not the end of the story. It may wound, but it also refines. It may break, but it also builds. It may seem to speak only of sorrow, but in truth it whispers of something greater, of a God who does not simply watch us suffer, but who enters into suffering himself, and through it leads us home. Pain in its rawest form seems like the ultimate enemy. It disrupts our plans, steals our joy, and casts long shadows over our lives. We recoil from it, instinctively believing that a world without suffering would be a better one. And yet, if we pause for even a moment and reflect, we will see that pain, though bitter, is not without meaning. It is not a senseless affliction thrust upon us by an indifferent universe. Rather, it has purpose woven into it, though we may not always recognize it at first. Consider the simplest realities of life. A child places his hand too close to a flame, and pain warns him to pull away before real harm is done. A broken bone, though agonizing, signals that something within must be set right. Even the ache of loss is a testament to the depth of love. We do not grieve that which we never cherished. Pain is often a messenger, calling our attention to something greater than itself. This is not to say that suffering is easy, nor that we should seek it out, but to dismiss it as meaningless is to miss the deeper truth. Pain has a way of refining us. Gold is purified through fire, and the soul, it seems, is shaped through suffering. How many of us have found that it was in our hardest moments that we grew the most? That the deepest wisdom, the strongest character, the most profound compassion, these did not arise from a life of ease, but from one that has walked through hardship. There is a certain arrogance in believing that our happiness is the highest goal, that if we suffer, something in the universe must be amiss. We forget that even nature itself follows a pattern of breaking and renewal. The seed must die before the tree can grow. The winter must strip the world bare before spring can bring new life. If we see this pattern in creation, why should we not expect to find it in ourselves? Moreover, pain has a way of shifting our perspective. It forces us to ask deeper questions, to move beyond the surface of things. When life is easy, we can become complacent, distracted, unaware, but suffering compels us to reckon with what truly matters. It strips away illusion, revealing truths we might otherwise have ignored. Perhaps this is why some of the greatest souls in history, those who have left behind legacies of wisdom, courage, and faith, were no strangers to suffering. They did not welcome pain, but they also did not waste it. They saw it for what it was, not an empty curse, but a tool in the hands of a master craftsman. Pain, then, is not pointless. It may be hard, even unbearable at times, but it is never without meaning. If we trust that there is purpose behind it, we may yet find that what wounds us today is shaping us for something greater tomorrow. There is a strange and troubling tendency in human nature. We are most forgetful of truth when life is easy. When all goes well, we drift into a kind of slumber, lulled by comfort, distracted by routine, and numbed by the predictable pleasures of daily life. It is suffering, sharp and unwelcome, that shakes us awake. Comfort, for all its sweetness, can be deceptive. It whispers that we are in control, that life is safe, that we need nothing beyond what we already have. But suffering tears away this illusion. When pain enters our lives, whether through loss, failure, or hardship, it forces us to confront reality as it truly is. We are not invincible. We are not self-sufficient. We are fragile beings, utterly dependent on forces greater than ourselves. There is something almost merciful about this awakening, though it does not feel like mercy at the time. A man who walks through life in a dreamlike stupor is in greater danger than one who suffers, but sees clearly. If we were left to our own devices, floating from one pleasure to the next, how many of us would ever stop to ask what life is truly about? How many would ever seek something beyond the fleeting joys of this world? Suffering, painful as it is, has the power to cut through the noise. It forces us to ask what truly matters. The things we once clung to, status, wealth, the opinions of others, suddenly seem small in the face of real pain. Grief strips away our illusions. Illness reminds us of our mortality. Betrayal exposes our misplaced trust, and in that breaking we begin to see what we could not before. History and literature are full of those who, only after great suffering, found wisdom they never would have sought otherwise. The prodigal son, blinded by the pleasures of his youth, only saw the truth when he was starving among the pigs. It was in his suffering that he woke up to the reality of his father's love. The same pattern plays out in countless lives. Men and women who only realized the shallowness of their pursuits when suffering forced them to look deeper. But if suffering awakens us, it is up to us to decide how we will respond. Some become bitter, blaming the world or God for their pain. Others allow suffering to refine them, to deepen their understanding, to lead them into a greater awareness of what is true and lasting. This is the choice before each of us. Suffering will come, no one escapes it. But if we see it as a teacher rather than just a tormentor, we will find that it can bring unexpected gifts. It sharpens our vision. It shakes us from complacency. It calls us to something higher. And perhaps in the end it does not so much steal our peace as clear the way for a truer, deeper peace, one that cannot be taken away. At the heart of the question of suffering lies a paradox. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why does he allow pain? Surely he could have created a world without sorrow, without loss, without suffering. But to demand such a world is to misunderstand the very nature of love and freedom. True love cannot be forced, it must be freely given, or it is not love at all. Imagine a world in which human beings had no ability to choose, no ability to turn away from good, to make mistakes, or even to grow through struggle. Such a world would not be one of love, but of programming. We would not be people, but puppets, moving only according to the strings of divine control. And what is love if it is merely dictated, with no choice in the matter? This is why God, in his wisdom, chose to create not a world of mere mechanical obedience, but one in which real freedom exists, and with that freedom comes the possibility of suffering. Not because God delights in our pain, but because he knows that a world where love is possible must also be a world where rejection, loss, and suffering exist. A world without suffering would be a world without free will, and a world without free will would be a world without true love. And a world without free will would be a world without true love. We see this truth in the everyday fabric of our lives. A parent who truly loves their child does not lock them away from every danger, every hardship, every failure. No, they teach, they guide, they warn, but ultimately they allow their child to make choices, and sometimes those choices lead to pain. But would we say that the parent should have denied the child the ability to choose, simply to shield them from suffering? Of course not, for in learning, in struggling, in choosing rightly or wrongly, the child becomes fully human, capable of love, of wisdom, of growth. This principle extends beyond individual choices. The world itself is shaped by human freedom. Many of the deepest sufferings we experience are not direct acts of God, but the result of human choices: wars, greed, cruelty, neglect. We cannot blame God for the suffering we inflict upon one another while insisting on our right to act freely. If we want to be free to love, to create, to build, then we must also be free to wound, to destroy, to turn away. The gift of freedom is great, but so too is its cost. Yet there is hope woven even into this reality. For though God does not strip away our freedom, neither does he leave us alone in our suffering. He works within it, drawing even the worst of our choices into his greater plan. He does not remove the consequences of our freedom, but he redeems them. He takes what is broken and brings forth something beautiful. Even in the darkest moments, he whispers, "This is not the end of the story." So, when we ask why God allows pain, we must remember, a world without pain would be a world without choice, and a world without choice would be a world without love. God does not force us into goodness, nor does he strip away our ability to choose wrongly. Instead, he offers us something far greater, true freedom, and with it the invitation to love him, to love others, and to find, even in suffering, the deeper purpose for which we were made. Love is often spoken of as the highest and most beautiful thing in life. We long for it, celebrate it, and see it as the foundation of our deepest joys. But what we often forget is that love, by its very nature, carries with it the possibility of pain. In fact, the greater the love, the greater the risk of suffering. If God created a world where love could truly exist, then it had to be a world where loss, rejection, and heartbreak were also possible. Imagine a world where pain did not exist, not because suffering had been healed, but because love itself had been removed. No one could betray another, because there would be no real trust to break. No one could experience grief, because there would be no true bonds of affection. No one could be hurt, but neither could they truly care. Would such a world be paradise, or would it be a hollow existence, stripped of the very things that make life meaningful? Real love requires real choice. To love someone means opening yourself up to the possibility of being hurt. A parent who loves their child does so, knowing that the child may one day walk away. A friend who trusts another takes the risk of betrayal. A spouse who commits to another does so without the certainty of what the future will hold. And yet, despite these risks, we love anyway. Why? Because we understand, whether consciously or not, that love is worth the risk. The possibility of loss does not make love meaningless, rather it makes it precious. If this is true in our human relationships, how much more must it be true in our relationship with God? He could have created a world where we had no choice but to love Him, no ability to turn away, no freedom to reject Him. But what would such love be? Nothing more than programmed obedience. It would not be real love at all. For love that is forced is not love. It is merely control disguised as affection. By giving us the freedom to love, God also gave us the freedom not to love. And when humanity turned away from Him, choosing selfishness, pride, and rebellion, pain entered the world, not because God desired it, but because love demanded the possibility of rejection. The moment we were given the ability to love truly, we were also given the ability to cause suffering. This is the unavoidable price of free will. Yet the story does not end there. Though love comes with the risk of pain, it also carries with it the power to redeem suffering. We see this most clearly in Christ Himself. He loved fully, and because He loved fully, He suffered fully. He was rejected, betrayed, abandoned, and crucified, not because He was weak, but because He refused to stop loving. In Him we see that love is not about avoiding pain, but about embracing it for the sake of something greater. When we love, we take a risk. We open ourselves to wounds, to grief, to loss. But this is the only way that love can be real. And in the end, love is the only thing that makes life worth living. So rather than ask why love comes with suffering, perhaps we should ask, would a world without love, without risk, without sacrifice, truly be better? No. Love is worth the risk. And the pain we endure because of love is not proof that something has gone wrong. It is proof that something truly beautiful exists. Pain has a strange way of turning our eyes upward. When life is easy, when everything goes according to plan, we hardly feel the need to seek something beyond ourselves. We drift through comfort, content with our own strength, believing, though perhaps not consciously, that we are in control. But suffering changes everything. It shakes the ground beneath our feet, strips away our illusions of self-sufficiency, and forces us to confront the reality that we are not as strong, not as independent as we once thought. It is in these moments of brokenness that we begin to seek God in earnest. C.S.Lewis once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. When we suffer, we listen more closely. We ask deeper questions. We reach beyond ourselves because we realize that we are not enough. Pain has the power to wake us from the sleep of self-reliance and make us aware of our desperate need for something greater." This is not to say that suffering automatically brings people to God. Some, in their pain, turn away in anger, believing that suffering is proof of His absence rather than His presence. But for many, suffering is the very thing that softens the heart, making it receptive to His voice. It is in the valley, not on the mountaintop, that we most often hear him calling. Think of how often people turn to God in times of crisis. The atheist cries out in desperation when facing death. The man who has ignored faith for years suddenly finds himself praying when his child is in danger. Why? Because suffering reminds us of our limits. It humbles us, showing us that we are not in control, that we cannot save ourselves. And when we reach the end of our strength, we are more willing to grasp the hand of the one who has been reaching for us all along. This does not mean that God causes suffering simply to force us to seek him. Rather, he uses the suffering that already exists in a fallen world to draw us closer to him. He does not waste our pain. He does not stand apart from it, cold and unmoved. Instead, he steps into it with us. He walked the path of suffering himself, bearing our pain on the cross, so that we would never have to endure it alone. In the end, suffering has a way of bringing us to the place where we can finally see God clearly. It humbles, refines, and strips away the distractions that once kept us from him. And if we allow it, pain can become the very thing that leads us into the deepest, most profound encounter with the God who has been calling us home all along. At first glance, suffering seems meaningless. It appears as a senseless force, tearing through our lives, leaving only pain and loss in its wake. But if we look deeper, if we see with the eyes of faith, we begin to recognize a remarkable truth. Suffering is not wasted. Even in the darkest moments, redemption is at work. Throughout history, we see that some of the greatest transformations come through suffering. Hardship refines character, loss deepens love, failure leads to wisdom. Pain has a way of shaping us into something stronger, something greater than we were before. And when we look at the story God is writing in the world, we see this pattern repeated again and again. Suffering is not the end of the story. It is the soil from which something greater can grow. Consider the lives of those who have endured suffering only to find meaning on the other side. The grieving mother who, after losing her child, dedicates her life to helping others in pain. The broken man who, after years of struggle, finds his purpose in guiding others through their darkness. The very wounds that once seemed unbearable become the means through which healing and purpose emerge. This is not to say that suffering is good in itself. Pain is real, grief is heavy, and God does not ask us to pretend otherwise. But he does promise that our suffering will not be meaningless. He weaves redemption into it, bringing beauty from what was broken. What seems like an ending can, in his hands, become a beginning. Nowhere is this truth clearer than in the life of Christ. The cross at first seemed like the ultimate defeat, betrayal, suffering, and death. But it was through the cross that salvation came. What looked like the end was actually the greatest victory. If God could bring redemption from the suffering of Christ, can he not also bring redemption from our own pain? This does not mean we will always see the purpose in our suffering right away. Sometimes in the midst of pain we cannot see beyond it, but faith allows us to trust that even when we do not understand, God is still at work. He is still redeeming, still shaping, still bringing good out of even the hardest moments. So when suffering comes, we have a choice. We can see it as meaningless, as a cruel twist of fate, or we can choose to believe that redemption is woven into it, that even in our pain, God is writing a greater story. And one day, whether in this life or the next, we will see the full picture. The broken pieces will be made whole. The sorrow will be turned to joy, and we will understand that through it all, he was bringing about something far greater than we ever could have imagined. When we are in the midst of suffering, it can feel as though pain is the final word, as if sorrow and loss have won. The weight of grief, the ache of disappointment, and the burden of affliction can seem unbearable. We cry out for answers, for relief, for some sign that our suffering is not in vain. But what if the pain we endure is not the conclusion of our story, but merely a chapter within it? What if suffering, no matter how deep, is not the end, but the beginning of something far greater? Throughout history, the greatest stories are not those without struggle, but those in which struggle is overcome. Imagine reading a novel where the hero never faces hardship, never endures loss, never fights for something greater than themselves. It would be a shallow tale, unworthy of our attention. The most powerful narratives, both in fiction and real life, are those where suffering is met with perseverance, where pain gives way to redemption, where the darkest night is followed by the brightest dawn. This pattern is not accidental. It is woven into the very fabric of existence. Winter yields to spring. The seed must fall into the earth and be buried before it can rise as a tree. The night, no matter how long, always gives way to morning. If we see this rhythm in nature, should we not also expect to see it in our own lives? Suffering is not where the story ends. It is often where transformation begins. This is the great promise of God, that no suffering, no pain, no loss is meaningless, even when we cannot see how, even when we feel lost in the darkness. He is still at work. What we endure now is not the final word. There is something greater beyond it. Scripture speaks to this truth again and again. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Psalm 35, verse 5. The suffering of today is real, but it is not eternal. The greatest example of this truth is found in Christ himself. His suffering on the cross appeared, to those who witnessed it, as the ultimate defeat. His followers mourned, believing all was lost, but what they did not yet see was that suffering was not the end of the story. 3 days later, the darkness was shattered by the light of resurrection. The pain was not wasted, the wounds were not in vain. The suffering led to something greater than anyone could have imagined. If this is the way God works, then we too can trust that our own suffering is not meaningless. It may feel overwhelming now, but it is not the end. There is redemption ahead, whether we see it in this life or in eternity. Every tear, every hardship, every trial is part of a greater narrative, one that leads not to despair but to hope. So when suffering comes, we do not need to face it with fear or hopelessness. We can endure, knowing that this pain is not forever. The story is still being written, and the final chapter is one of restoration, healing, and joy beyond measure. What is broken will be made whole, what is lost will be found, and what we suffer now will one day be transformed into something far greater than we could ever have imagined.